boca de Dios. Somos bendichos todos los pueblos. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Boca de Dios, de boca de Dios. Bendichos todos los pueblos. Shabbat Shalom. In the spirit of convivencia, which is a Spanish word from the golden age of Spain, during a period of time when the children of Abraham lived together and created a magnificent culture of art and business and dancing and philosophy and poetry and healing. This is a convivencia of Shabbat, returning to convivencia, to create a space in time when we remember that peace is possible because it is our choice. And so we begin tonight by lighting a flame, an ancient flame that Jewish women have carried for over 4,000 years, to return our people to be Shomer Shalom, to be guardians of peace in the family, in the community, among nations, in the world. This is our destiny. This is where we are walking. This is our Sabeel.
Bendito sea el Dios, Señor del mundo, Padre de las piedades, que nos alumbra con la luz del Shabbat. Amén.
In the spirit of convivencia, we remember that the Jewish people, the Christian community, and the Muslim community, and the Jewish community, all of us, we share in Father Abraham, in Ibrahim, who we attribute a vision of peace. And so we remember that we are indeed one family with many different expressions, but united in our faith that we can be together in peace. And so I invite Naim Atik, a messenger of peace to us, to say a prayer over the Sabbath candles.
I ask God on this eve of the Sabbath to bless all the children, especially the Palestinian children, that they might grow up with Israeli children, Jewish children, in peace and in reconciliation. Amen.
But I know we also have this common communion in the bread. of the Sabbath bread, as you can see, is woven, which represents our community, that we live together. We are woven together. Our destinies are intertwined. And so we cannot build a world based on separation and fear. Sabbath teaches us to build a world based on creation and liberation. And so we say the prayers together, and I'll ask you to say the prayer that you have in your heart for blessing the bread, and I'll say our prayer for blessing the bread, and we'll all say it together, and it will sound very chaotic, and then you'll be at a Jewish service. So we say it together in whatever language, in the language that you love, in Arabic, in English, in Spanish, French, whatever languages are in this room, your own prayer for blessing the bread. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach ha'olam hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
While many of you know Jeff Halper, I'm nevertheless going to introduce him. It's my pleasure to do so. Jeff Halper was actually born and grew up in Minnesota, and he studied anthropology, was an academic. He moved to Israel in 1973, and he left academia to work full-time for the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which I think most of you know, but if not, it's a nonviolent Israeli peace and human rights organization dedicated to resisting the Israeli occupation and bringing about a just peace in Israel-Palestine. Jeff is the author of numerous books. His latest book is Warfare Against the People of Israel, the Palestinians, and the Global Pacification Industry. He also has another book in the exhibit area that you can look at. Jeff participated in the first and successful attempt of the Free Gaza movement to break the Israeli siege by sailing into Gaza. He serves on the International Support Committee of the Bertrand Russell Tribunal on Palestine, and he was also nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. One of the things you might not know about Jeff, however, was that Bob Dylan attended his bar mitzvah. Now you know. And when he had a different name. So with that, I'm so happy to introduce Jeff Halper.
Well, okay, it's good to be here. If it's Friday, it must be Albuquerque. And this, I was counting with Dick Toll last night. This is something like my 32nd Sabeel conference. So there's some of you that have heard me 32 times. And, which means I have to think of 32 new things to say every time I come. And in fact, you know, I've been struggling with with what is my message. Not only here, but I'm on a speaking tour in the States. And right now we're between solutions. We're really in a political limbo where there's no political movement, there's no political process. We're all pretty stuck. So in a sense, I changed a little bit my title. I hope Kathy doesn't get upset at me. It was, where are we headed in Palestine, Israel? originally towards peace or apartheid or warehousing. In other words, where are we headed on the ground? What is Israel creating, constructing? And I'll refer to that. But in a sense, what's kind of preoccupying me, I guess, is where are we headed in terms of ending this conflict? You know, and as I've been kind of struggling with what I'm going to say, Melinda mentioned that I was in Gaza with the first boats that went through. And there's a book for sale called Freedom Sailor that tells about the two boats that went into Gaza in August 2008. What stayed in my mind and what sort of got me onto a certain track, I was the only Israeli that went into Gaza on those boats. But I went in as an Israeli. I mean, I wanted to be known that I'm an Israeli, and I was, you know, accepted that way. People were actually kind of excited to be able to speak Hebrew again, because many of the men in Gaza worked in Tel Aviv and other places for many years before they were locked out. And one evening, we were sitting in a coffee shop, no electricity, because Israel doesn't provide enough electrical power to Gaza. So large parts of Gaza are blacked out. But we're sitting just talking, me and a whole bunch of Palestinians from Gaza and a few other people. And what the conversation was, and one of the Palestinian fellows said this in Hebrew, the conversation was actually being held in Hebrew, was, how do we get out of this mess? How do we get out of this mess? And what was heartening for me in that conversation was that it wasn't a political discussion. In other words, it wasn't one state, 2 states, 10 states, this, that. There was a we in there. You know, and I'm certainly not trying to normalize colonization, which could be one way of looking at what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I think enough time has passed that there is a certain we with all the conflicts and the oppression and the occupation and so on. There's still a sense, the way it was meant was, how do we get out of this? I mean, why can't you bring your kids to Gaza, to the beach, to have fish? Why can't I go live in Tel Aviv? I mean, that was really, and from the point of view of the head of an Israeli peace and human rights organization, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, I see ourselves as a political actor. In other words, I'm an academic, I'm an anthropologist, I write books, I do research. But, you know, for me, that all is grist for the mill in terms of trying to further a political struggle. Now, what's interesting about the Sabeel conference, I was talking to Naim about it last night. I remember, I don't know how many conferences ago in Atlanta, when the theme was hope. And then there was a whole issue, is kind of a religious term. I don't know if that's a political term very much. And I kind of was resisting that. But the title of this conference is Justice. So we've moved a good step, really towards justice as a concept. And I have a kind of a little thing. You know, you're always an academic. So, you know, I can't go without a blackboard and chalk and stuff. So, you know, hope is important. You know, it sustains you in a sense. I mean, it keeps you from falling into despair. You know, it keeps you focused to a certain degree. It sustains you, hope. I mean, I'm not downplaying hope. I don't think you can build a political movement on hope. But nevertheless, it's an element. And now we've kind of moved towards justice. And Naim talked about that today, you know, in which you really begin to start to define where are you going. I mean, that's certainly a key concept. And we're guided by international law and human rights. In other words, we don't have to start from scratch to invent where should we be going in Israel, Palestine, or anywhere in the world. There is a vision There's a set of principles, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. There's a wonderful body of international laws. So to some degree, we have some, no one can see you. Maybe that's good. I'm down here because I wanted to be by the screen. You can't see me in the back? No, I can run it from up there. That's not the problem. The problem is there a way? Well, I don't want to get into the whole thing. All right, you know what? All right, I can do it. I can see it from my screen if people feel the need to see. How's that? It's going to test my ability to see my computer from here, but okay. At any rate, all right. Now I see what Ali meant by controlling things here. So justice, I think justice is a key component, and like I'm saying, we're guided, we're directed by a very thought out and detailed definition of justice. And I always say to religious groups, faith-based groups, that human rights dovetail with religious values. The religious values that we all hold, love, compassion, peace, justice, and so on, have really been nailed down over the last 60-some years, especially through the UN system. So now, you don't only have a right to be loved and to be secure and to be included and to be equal and so on, but that is actually your human right. And now there's supposed to be a body of law. We have problems with implementation that really nails down what those rights are. So we've come really far in terms of justice. But there's a couple of other elements that I think we have to put into the equation, and that's what I want to talk about tonight a little bit. You know, we're in a political struggle. And I think that's, this isn't just something happening in a vacuum. We're in a political struggle for justice, in this case for justice for Palestinians and Israelis in a sense. And I think we have to see ourselves as political actors. In other words, our job is not simply to protest. It isn't simply to do BDS. BDS is very important. Raise consciousness and mobilize and explain and advocate. But our job is to change government's policies. Our job is to end the occupation. Our job is to achieve a just peace, whatever just peace means. And that's one of the problems I'll talk about. We don't have a common definition of that yet. And so I go to, but it's a political struggle, and if it's a political struggle, it needs agency. In other words, that's a fancy academic term, for it needs people and organizations to actually do that. Let's say BDS succeeds, and the entire Israeli economy collapses, and the occupation collapses, or what could very easily happen is the Palestinian Authority could collapse, or the whole situation in the Middle East collapses if there's an attack on Iran. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios. Who picks up the pieces? I mean, who's the actor here? And in a sense, we need agency in terms of not just mobilizing people, but giving them direction, giving them leadership, and creating political forums and frameworks and bodies that can actually pick up the pieces. In South Africa, the ANC was really an agency. They weren't only organized, but there was a freedom charter that Ali mentioned today, and there was a constitution for South Africa that was drafted before apartheid ended. So when apartheid ended, and it surprised us all. I mean, there was nothing in the cards that would have predicted that de Klerk was all of a sudden going to come out and do that. It wasn't chaos. There was a transition because there was agency. You need that piece of it. You also need a common vision and a program. Where are we going? So we're doing BDS, boycotts, divestment, sanctions, but towards what end? So in South Africa, if I can go back to that, because that's sort of inspired all of us, we had sanctions against the apartheid regime, but it was linked to a clear political goal. Not only the end of apartheid or end of occupation, but one person, actually the slogan is one man, one vote. We'd probably change that today. One person, one vote. That's where we're going. And we're missing that common vision and program. And then there was also a very effective strategy and organization. So these are, I think, elements of a political struggle that we're missing today. We're lacking. We're not only stuck in terms of a political process, but we haven't yet formulated our common vision, a program, and really organized and become an agency that in order to become a political actor. And I don't want to be, what the left tends to be, or what progressive people tend to be, kind of gadflies. We protest, we have our little demonstrations, we occupy, whatever, but we don't really believe that we're going to change policy. We do it, and it's a good catharsis, and we go home. And we write articles because we're articulate, but we don't expect to change the political reality. That isn't acceptable to me, at least, and therefore I'm asking, in this limbo, where are we going, and how can we get there, so that when a political limbo can be a time like we have now. It's a space in which there's a process, and you can kind of think about things, and sometimes you fight with each other and fragmentize in a limbo when nothing's happening, everybody's grabbing turf. Or we can use this space that we have, in a sense, to really begin to sit down and formulate things and talk to each other, and to begin to galvanize, to forge a kind of a common vision and program. And I'm coming out of that because I think it's lacking. Just a few weeks ago, ICAD, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, my organization, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, has said for years, and many of you have said it, and now it's getting to be, I think, common knowledge, that the two-state solution is dead. It's gone. I've written that I think we should even stop talking about it, because the more you talk about a solution that's irrelevant, you're simply obfuscating, you're confusing things, you're talking about things that are gone. So that ICAD decided, okay, all right, but we're not Palestinians. So our position has always been, we have to follow the Palestinians' lead. This is the Palestinians' call. Are we going for one state, 2 states, 10 states, a confederate? What the solution is not our place, certainly as Israelis, but also as non-Palestinians to say. And so we've held back. We analyze, we're very critical. Many of you have been on our tours, we have maps, I write a lot, and other people in our organization. We say the two-state solution is gone, we're for ending the occupation, but we've held back from that natural question of how do we get out of this mess? Where are we going? What do we want? And finally, we sort of said, look, the Palestinians really aren't leading us on this. And I can understand that. The Palestinian leadership has been decimated by Israel. Israel and the international community have imposed, I think, a kind of a regime, the Palestinian Authority on the Palestinians, that is not helping them towards liberation. People are exhausted. They're impoverished. I mean, they're fragmented. The Palestinians are scattered all over. I can well understand why there isn't a Palestinian agency, why there isn't a stronger voice, why there isn't real leadership. But at the same time, I'm there on the ground, and I see house demolitions going on. 27,000 homes demolished in the occupied territory since 1967. Just 2 months ago, and some of you are here, we rebuilt a home for the 5th time that had been demolished 5 times as an act of political resistance, not humanitarian. And ICAT has built 186 homes in the occupied territories as joint acts of political resistance together with Palestinians. But you know, Israel in some ways is nailing this thing down. We're not in a vacuum. The settlements are expanding. Israel is on the verge. And if it happened before the American elections, I wouldn't be surprised, of annexing Area C. Area C is 60% of the West Bank. It's 62% of the West Bank. But there's been a whole process of forced expulsion of Palestinians out of the country and into what we call areas A and B. You could see on the map that's why I wanted to be in front of the screen. I'm going to run back and forth. You're going to have to excuse me. But because I saw the hands, not everybody has been to Sabeel conferences, so I want to kind of push forward, but at the same time give people that don't know the lay of the land a certain context. You know, this is a map of the West Bank. Gaza is a cage over here. But essentially, you know, it's been divided into areas A, B, and C by the Oslo peace process, plus East Jerusalem, which is a part of the occupied territories, but that's been annexed to Israel. Although Palestinians living in East Jerusalem don't have Israeli citizenship. It just complicates things further. But what's happened, what I'm just referring to, is the fact that areas A and B, that are the darker and lighter brown, beige areas on the map, that are only 40% or 38% of the occupied territories, and that fragmented into about 70 little islands, that's where more than 95% of the Palestinians are confined. They're confined to Gaza, little ghettos, little disconnected cantons or enclaves in East Jerusalem, and then into areas A, B, and C, A and B. And they've been and all the rest is C, all the gray area, plus I'll mention in a minute these pink areas that are kind of settlement blocks. 62% of the West Bank that surrounds all these islands with Israeli highways and settlements and so on has been cleared to a large degree of Palestinians. So today, on the 62% of the West Bank that is Area C, there's less than 5% of the Palestinian population. So what Israel is, I think, poised to do is to annex Area C, because that would nail the whole thing down. Today we're arguing occupation and this and the UN and Abu Mazen who wants a Palestinian. Let's finish this whole thing. Let's annex Area C, the 62% of the West Bank that contains all the settlements, right? And we'll give the Palestinians living in Area C Israeli citizenship, because there's so few left that we can do that without upsetting any demographic balance. There's between 75, maybe, and 125,000 Palestinians left in Area C. So we'll give them citizenship, and then you can't cry apartheid. A and B, that's not our issue. A and B belong to the Palestinian Authority. We have no interest in ruling over Ramallah or Tulkarm or Hebron or Gaza. That's not our problem. If they want a state, it can be a state. If the international community gets upset about it, let them help the Palestinians. In other words, we've ended the occupation. We've ended the conflict by annexing Area C, and let the Palestinians and others worry about whatever the status of A and B is. If they want to be a state, we'll say to the United States, give them a state in the United Nations. As long as it's in areas A and B, that's fine. That's fine with Israel. So what I'm saying is, just to go back for a second, literally, so what I'm saying is that the fact that we're stuck and we're in a limbo and we don't have agency and we don't really know where we're going and we're in this open-ended process stands in stark contrast to the fact that things are happening on the ground. Israel is not in a limbo. Israel knows exactly where it's going, with especially American support and international support. And in fact, and I bring this up and I say this to sober us a little bit. We live in the United States, or you live in the United States, Hollywood. Everybody believes in happy endings. Freedom always wins. Justice always defeats injustice. Well, that doesn't have to be. There could actually be a scenario where the occupation wins. I mean, if we look at I'll talk about that in a second, if we look around at the physical landscape in Palestine and the political landscape around, Israeli leaders feel pretty good. They don't see many countervailing forces. All right, there's BDS, and as Ali said, they're concerned a little bit about that, but they don't have to be concerned from the point of view that we have no way to turn BDS into a political ask, into a change in policy, because BDS is disconnected from a goal, from an end game. And so, Israel, its image can be dented and this and that, but it isn't really a political movement that's going to lead us towards something. It's an important strategy and tool, but it's not a replacement for agency, vision, and a political plan and program. So we're in this situation where on the one hand, and the reason I got into all of this is because a couple of weeks ago, we decided, well, you know what? We can't really wait forever. We know we're stepping over a certain line, but on the other hand, we've been resisting all these years. ICAD has been active for 15 years. We have a certain right sometimes to cross a red line. We're going to advocate for a one-state solution. We're going to bite the bullet, and we put out a draft statement saying ICAD endorses a one democratic state solution. And we sent it around, a draft statement, especially to our Palestinian partners, because we wanted to get their feedback and to tweak it and to see if this is, we tried to sort of not get approval exactly, but that they know it's coming and we get feedback and so on. And the silence was deafening. There was almost no feedback. And the feedback we got was, it's too early to advocate for a one-state solution. It's too divisive. I was actually talking to Don last night. Sabeel doesn't endorse a one-state solution because the idea is that, it's hard enough to find a venue for a Sabeel conference. You go to a one-state solution and you might as well meet at my house, And many Palestinians feel like that. Even the BNC, even the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in Palestine does not endorse a one-state solution. And in fact, many still support a two-state solution. So in a sense, this whole idea that we're stuck, we're in a limbo, it's not time, we can't organize, we're tired, we're not, we're fragmented, there's no leadership, the Palestinians, all that is true, but what I'm saying is we're in a real political struggle where real if I can say this in a church, real shit is happening on the ground. That's the only way I can put it. We're not in some vacuum. And I think it's our responsibility as ICAD, at least, to start to push things a little bit. To say, if we are going to become political actors, we've got to start advocating for a solution. We can't mobilize people forever, and it's open-ended like that. And that's where, and I'm sort of struggling with that. But that's sort of what I want to talk to and kind of review what that would mean. I'd like to see us kind of start this sort of a process. So the question is, all right, where would we start something like that? And by we, I mean all of us. I mean Palestinians wherever they are, because this process has to be led by Palestinians. It can't be led by you people. I mean, BDS is great, but the international community is not going to liberate Palestine. It can't be led by Israelis. I mean, I don't think I have to explain that. It has to be led by Palestinians. We have to get more leadership than we're getting, and I think there has to be a major Israeli voice, because as much as we don't like the idea of Israel and Zionism and the discourse today is settler colonialism and all of that, Israelis are there, and they're going to stay there. And there's two peoples in that country, and even if we talk about one state, one democratic state, the reality is a binational reality. And so I think with a Palestinian lead, and with Israelis, and there's some Israelis that have been in this conference that would contribute, and then mobilizing all of you, that we could begin that kind of a process of developing a strategy, a program, a vision, and agency. The first place we would start, in my view, is that the two-state solution is dead. And we have to stop talking about it. We have to get past the two-state solution. It's very hard to do because, for two reasons. From the Palestinian side, it's a chance to get a Palestinian state. There are people that say, I want a state. I don't care if it's on 22% of Palestine. I want to be in the Olympics. I want a Palestinian flag. I want a Palestinian government. I want some measure of self-determination. It's taken us 50 years to get the two-state solution on the international agenda. Obama supports a two-state solution. What do you want us to do? Throw that out and start all over again? Oh, God, now we got to start talking about one state and what does that mean and So there's resistance to giving up the two-state solution on the part of Palestinians. And there's also obvious resistance on the part of Israelis. And groups, even liberal groups like J Street. Because if you're coming from a Zionist place, even a liberal Zionist place, Israel has got to be a Jewish state. And therefore, there's got to be a Palestinian state next door. So that as the two-state solution disappears, what's happening to J Street and these groups is that they're beginning to assert that the two-state solution has to be the solution. It's not coming, it's not there. It's disappearing, it's gone. I think it's gone. And they're not stupid people. They can see that it's gone, but they can't go there. They can't go to where the end of the two-state solution will lead, which is the end of Israel as a Jewish state, and which I don't think is a terrible thing, the transformation of the country into a binational, multicultural, multi-religious, democratic society. That's not a terrible specter for me, but it frightens Israelis and Jews. So that there's a lot, so that people are holding on with their fingernails on both sides to the two-state solution. But I think that's holding us back because it's not going to happen. And just to take just a couple minutes, because I don't know if the prayer cut into my speaking time. We'll have to negotiate that. All right. I just want to take a minute for those of you that don't know, and just say for just in 3 minutes why the two-state solution is gone, so we can begin to move beyond that. You know, the two-state solution was a solution that was actually accepted by everyone, almost. I mean, and it envisions a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel. It's not obviously a just solution. It's not a fair solution. I mean, the Palestinians get all the occupied territories are only 22% of historic Palestine. But in 1988, the PLO accepted the two-state solution. In 2002, the entire Arab League unanimously accepted the two-state solution. The American government, I always say even the American government, and the international community have all accepted the two-state solution. And it's actually a pretty good deal for Israel. I mean, here, after everything else, you get to keep 78% of historic Palestine. Wow, that's a pretty good deal. And in fact, the majority of Israeli Jews accept the two-state solution. You know, the Oslo peace process had about an 80% support rate in Israel. Today, 70% of Israeli Jews still support the idea of a two-state solution. So what's wrong with it? Where's the bad news? It sounds great. Why don't we sign tomorrow morning? Because it's successive Israeli governments that for different reasons and with minority, I don't quite agree with Miko. I don't think it's Zionism. There isn't any such animal as Zionism. But, I mean, there's a lot of Zionisms, and there's a lot of parties, and there's a lot of views, and so on. But nevertheless, there's a power configuration in government in which the settlers and the right wing have control, and therefore it's Israel that refuses a two-state solution. The only imponderable was Rabin. Would Rabin have gone there or not gone there? It was too early. Was he in a process when he was assassinated? We'll never know. But besides that, imponderable, the whole thrust has been towards eliminating, and I think Israel did it, eliminating the two-state solution. That's been Israeli government policies, certainly officially since 1977, when Begin was elected and Sharon became the czar of settlement activity, the architect of that whole thing. So you know what? All right. 45 years have passed. 35 years of right-wing government have passed. Billions of dollars, unlimited domestic political support, American political support for this whole thing. It's done. It's not a very big area. Doesn't take very long to eliminate any possibility of a Palestinian state. And what Israel has then done is it's laid what I call a matrix of control over the occupied territories to make its occupation permanent. And I'm not going to get into a whole thing. I don't have time tonight, but you know, like I said, fragmenting the territories into areas A and B, building more than 200 settlements, moving more than 500,000 Israelis into the occupied territories, building a huge system of highways, 29 major Israeli-only apartheid highways that then reconfigure the entire country. Because the whole two-state idea is a north-south axis kind of a thing. There's in Israel, and alongside of it, actually on both sides, is a Palestinian state. So Sharon and the planners broke that by creating highways and settlement blocks. These pink areas are major settlement blocks with major cities in them to break that, you know, to create an east-west connection into Israel, so that today the West Bank is an integral part of the body of Israel and cannot be detached. And there's no political will to detach it, And there's no international political will to detach it. That's the important thing. Israel's trump card is Congress. I mean, there's not a member of Congress, hardly. I mean, we all know the names of the 5 or 6 exceptions that would even agree to a small settlement being dismantled, let alone Ma'ale Adumim settlement, or Israel giving up East Jerusalem. So from the point of view of the facts on the ground, and the international will, and Israeli government policy, it's gone. And I was going to get into something else with Bush, but I'm not going to do that. The other element, of course, that really nails this down in concrete is the wall. The apartheid wall, what we call the separation wall, the separation barrier. We use the term apartheid in Israel, officially. The name of the wall in Hebrew is Michshol Hafrada. Hafrada in Hebrew, Hafrada, is apartheid in Hebrew, or separation. Our policy towards the Palestinians is called separation or apartheid. We simply say it in Hebrew and not in Afrikaans. So that's the concept. And you see the wall basically creates these cantons of a Palestinian Bantustan and then incorporates the settlement blocks and most of the West Bank into Israel. And, you know, that's a fact on the ground. Go move that. So that with all of that, I think the two-state solution is finished, and we're looking at a Bantustan. All right, so moving back up to a higher level of discussion. So I think, and you know, now's not the time to prove it, but I think the proof is there that we have to move beyond. So where are we going then? If the two-state solution is gone, so where are we going? And that's where we're stuck today. Many people are saying it's gone, but nobody is, I mean, there's beginning to be a few voices here and there, but we don't have a very strong voice. So first of all, I think we have some hints of where to go. The PINGO, the Palestinian NGO network, kind of the left of Palestinian civil society that the BDS movement belongs to, and many of the groups we work with belong to, have set out the 3 elements that have been mentioned before in terms of beginning to identify some fundamental elements that we have to move towards. End of occupation, right of return for refugees, and equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that helps, but it's not a plan. I mean, these are elements that have to be in a plan. I would suggest, I've worked up 5 elements that I think should be a part of a solution. So they're elements that are kind of geared toward thinking about what has to go into a solution. So at least whatever solution you come up with, whether it's 2 states or 1 state or democratic or binational or a federation, or I'm going to talk about in a second, get ready, 7 options. Whatever you're talking about, it's guided by these 5 elements. I mean, you know, it could be 6 elements, 4. I mean, it's not a scientific thing, but that I think are crucial to any solution. In other words, what I'm arguing is that if all of these 5 elements are present, a lot of solutions could work. Even a 2-state solution could, in principle, work if you have these elements. If any one of these elements is missing, it's not going to work. I don't care how good it looks on paper, it's not going to work. And if I can read from here, just quickly, I mean, the first element, you know, again, is using instruments at our control. We don't have to start from scratch. It is that any solution, any just peace, has to conform to human rights and international law. I mean, that's the roadmap. You don't need a Bush roadmap. You don't need an Oslo process, an Annapolis process. This is the roadmap. These are the principles, and they're very detailed in terms of where we go. and these rights respect both a collective and individual rights of the people of that country. The second element, and here's where I get into hot water, and that is we've got to accept, in my view, that we're living in a binational reality in Israel-Palestine. Whether it should be binational, whether Zionism is a colonial movement, whether it's made up, whether the Jews ever lived there 2,000 years ago, or they're a bunch of Russians that pretended to be something, it doesn't matter. Those might be issues later on. When we come afterwards to reconciliation, maybe we'll have to go back and deal with some of those issues and to begin to correct our narratives. I mean, every people has a narrative. But the reality is that there are two peoples, if you don't want to call them nations, peoples, whatever, living in it. That's why this conference is called Palestine, Israel. This isn't a conference about justice in Palestine. This is a conference that's entitled Justice in Palestine, Israel, that recognizes there are two peoples, two nations that live in that country. I think if you don't start there, if you start going back to arguing who was first and what self-determination and who has it, and there's no end to it. There's no way to go with that, in my view. We've got to bite the bullet and say it's a binational reality, and any peace has to be inclusive of both peoples. And I'm saying that's very, we're withdrawing, we're retreating from that today. And we're moving towards a settler colonial kind of a discourse in which everything that has to do with Zionism and Israel and self-determination of Jews and the Jewish place in the country is being questioned. I mean, it should be questioned. There's real problematics with it. But to have that principle, even if it's true, as the basis of a political movement is a non-starter. There are Israeli Jews. They're there. And there are Palestinian Arabs, and I think that's the grounding, the basis from which we have to work. Third, we have to address squarely the refugee issue. No fudging. The refugees have the right of return. All Palestinians have a right of return. And the right of return itself, I don't think is so problematic. But there's two other elements I'll just mention that I think are no less important than the actual technical arrangement of who gets compensation, who comes back, where do they come to, and all that stuff. And that is that, first of all, Israel has got to accept that this is a right of return. It's not a humanitarian gesture that we're going to let 50,000 Palestinians in, or 100,000, or whatever. This is a right. And second of all, and this is really crucial, Israel has got to acknowledge what it did to the Palestinians. It has to. And we all know how important acknowledgement is. Victims need that acknowledgement. So every time somebody gets up and denies the Holocaust or questions, the Jews go bananas. And rightly so. I mean, victims need the injustice and what happened to them to be acknowledged. But it's the same with the Palestinians. There has to be an acknowledgement of the injustice. Israel has got to take responsibility, and that's actually the hardest part. I think Israel would rather let 4 million refugees back into the country before it would want to apologize and acknowledge. So in other words, the symbolic parts of the refugee issue, as well as the more technical and human rights based, that has to be done. The fourth element of any just peace is that we have to address the security concerns of everybody in the region. Israelis, Palestinians, but within the region. I don't think that's too problematic. And the fifth, and this is where I begin to think, and I'll show you in a second, of a little bit of another model, is I think we have to begin to adopt a regional approach. Israel-Palestine is too small an area to cram all the solutions into. The basic problems facing our peoples are regional. Most Palestinians don't live in Palestine. You know, half of them live in the region, especially in Jordan, but in Syria and Lebanon. Water. We have no water. The water comes from Syria and Lebanon. Economic development, security. All of these issues are important. So even if there was a wonderful peace in Israel-Palestine and the country was prospering and everything is great and the Palestinian diaspora kicks in, a prosperous country in a region that's poor and autocratic and unstable isn't going to work. People that deal in development, you know, so-called third world development, know that you need an even regional approach. If you develop one piece of a region and the other piece is not, it wouldn't be good for the Palestinians or the Israelis or anyone else. So I think we have to begin to think on a regional basis. So on the basis of these elements, and we can argue with, discuss them, add to them, whatever, this is what has to happen, is a discussion on these kinds of things that we're not having. There's very few forums in which we're actually sitting down and talking about this. But on the basis of this, I would suggest that there are 7 possible solutions, or let's say resolutions of the conflict, not necessarily solutions. And I just want to, if I can come down for a minute and join you. The air is better down here. That I just want to share with you, because I think it'll clarify a little bit the options. Now, I don't know where we're going. I don't think today we have one option we can say this is where we're going, this is what most people suggest, and there's problems with all of them. But at least it begins to give us a certain context in which to talk. The 2 states, we can go fairly fast with most of them. The 2-state solution, which is certainly an option, is gone. So let's stop talking about it. The second option is apartheid. In other words, that's exactly where Israel is going. Israel sees apartheid. All right, I'm going to say something even weirder than that. Apartheid is the solution to the conflict of the liberals. It's the liberal solution. It's the Labor Party solution. The Labor Party solution is, yes, let's have a Palestinian state based on roughly areas A and B and Gaza, and that's apartheid. In other words, it's a regime of permanent domination of one group over another. That's apartheid. I don't care if it's based on race or religion or nationality or the color of your eyes. Once you have a regime based on separation and domination, that conforms to the laws against the crime of apartheid. That's the liberal approach, and I would hope that that's unacceptable to everyone here. The third option is warehousing. And warehousing is actually the policy of the present government. It's the right-wing approach. Warehousing, I'm not going to get into it too much, the term comes from the prison world. Prisoners are warehoused. And it comes from the United States, because your country has, the United States has 6% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. But where are they? They're gone. They've disappeared. Out of sight, out of mind. Certainly prison reform is not one of the major presidential issues. I don't think it'll be in the debates. Prisoners have disappeared. And they should disappear because they're bad people. And they're inmates, and we feed them. They're being warehoused. They're in a static situation. There's no process. There's no legitimacy, nothing. They're just locked away, the keys thrown away, and we feed them. And that's where Israel is going in terms of the Palestinians. That's why I say, one thing we have to take into account is that Israel could win, especially given the American position towards Israel. And that is that Israel is trying to normalize the situation, to quietize it, to pacify the Palestinians. And they do that with the help of the Palestinian Authority. Many Palestinians say we're living under two occupations. So, you got a double layer of oppression. And to quietize so that it simply goes, the Palestinian issue goes away like the prisoner issue. So that Netanyahu last May came to the States, met Obama again. They talked about Iran, all this stuff. He came home and he was asked on the news, why are we covering this? I mean, you've been to the States 100 times, you talked to Obama, it's the same. What's the news here? And Netanyahu said, my visit was the first time in memory that an Israeli prime minister met an American president and the Palestinian issue wasn't even mentioned. Wasn't even on the agenda. It was Iran and military aid and other issues. So there's a real possibility that Israel could normalize or try to normalize. That's where we come in. That's where BDS is so important, and Sabeel conferences, and the work of JVP and the US campaign and all the organizations, because we're keeping this issue alive and on the map. But it's not enough to be in a holding pattern. We've got to become more proactive. So warehousing, I think there's a consensus probably that that's unacceptable. Well, there's another option that's emerging more and more, and that's what I call the Algerian model. This is, in a sense, on the one hand, it's a Zionist model. The idea being that we've come back to the land of Israel, it's our country, the Jews are the only people, the nation that has self-determination, and we're going to Judaize the country, which is a term we use, and displace the Palestinian population. So when we liberate Palestine, it becomes Jewish, which is certainly a model that we know, and that's unacceptable. But there's beginning to be a little bit on the Palestinian side, a kind of a counterpart to that. And that is, you're beginning to, as the colonial discourse, the idea that Zionism is simply a settler colonial movement. It's a bunch of Europeans that came to Palestine, that had no connection to it, helped by the European powers, in a sense being agents of European colonialism. They're like the French in Algeria. And therefore, more and more you're beginning to hear, especially in the younger generation of Palestinians, you're beginning to hear the idea that when Palestine is liberated, the Jews go home. The Jews are, if in fact the Jews in Palestine are simply colonial settlers, and there's no legitimacy to being Israeli at all, then go home. Wherever home is. I mean, that's one of the problems with that colonial model, is there isn't a France to go home to, but that's beginning to be a model that I'm not discounting, I'm reporting that that's becoming a stronger version of things, especially I think among younger Palestinians, and it's a weird kind of a counterpart to the Zionist idea. So we have to understand that's part of the discussion. And it certainly is, in my view, and now I'm speaking as an anthropologist, is that it ignores the national element. This is not the United States, Israel, Palestine. The United States is a special place, like Australia, like Argentina, in which immigrants came. It wasn't completely empty, but the Native Americans were pretty much discounted or whatever. But the idea was then there was a sort of a neutral American identity. There was an overarching American identity, and then you could be ethnic. You're ethnic. You can be an Arab American, Jewish American, Polish American, Asian American, Latino, whatever it is, the hyphenated American. But that is not the case in most of the world, including the Middle East, where national identities, and they're not necessarily national in the 19th century sense, but national meaning primary identities, preceded states. States are all new. I mean, there was never a Jordan, and Lebanon was created by France. Until today, Syria does not recognize Lebanon as a state because it's seen as a colonial creation of, as a matter of fact, the Syrians sometimes talk about Greater Syria, which creates some tensions with the Palestinians. But the point is that one person, one vote is, if you're ethnic, if you're simply a member of a state, that's okay. But it ignores the national elements. Zionism is a national movement. Legitimate or not, it was a national movement. The Palestinian Liberation Movement. The Palestinian movement is a national liberation movement. It's not a civil rights movement. It isn't talking about equal rights and let's all vote. It's talking about Palestinian nationalism. We want a Palestinian state. We want a flag. We want to be in the Olympics. We want to be in the UN. So that there's a national element here that the one democratic state has to factor in. And it usually isn't factored in. If you look, there's a group now called the One Democratic State Movement. In their declaration, there's nothing that says anything about national identities and so on. So that the fifth option, I think, is a binational state. Now, you could combine, and this is really what Ali Abu Nima suggests, certainly in his book, is a combination. A binational state means a state in which the national expression, the national identities, the narratives of both peoples are acknowledged and respected. But then what you try to do is to create one democratic state. I mean, that's what we have to talk about. Binational states don't work normally. Even Belgium didn't have a government for a year. You know, Canada's having its issues. And that's, you know, not as deep as the Israel-Palestine issue. Not to mention Cyprus, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, the former Yugoslavia, and on and on and on. So that if we're going and thinking about one state, how to combine the democratic and binational elements is tricky. But in a way, it's a challenge. In other words, I kind of have an idea of what I call global Palestine. I think Palestine is a microcosm of all kinds of processes and struggles that are really global. I think the reason why the Palestinian issue is so important is that for the oppressed peoples of the world, the Palestinians, including the poor people in this country, the Palestinians are this entity, this people, this little grain of sand that's resisting. It's resisting Israel, it's resisting American arms, it's resisting neo-imperialism, resisting the humiliation of Islam, resisting all kinds, there's much larger issues here in Palestine. So in a sense, I think if we saw our conflict, if we saw and then began to expand that, not as a conflict, okay, but as an opportunity, not only to settle our problems between Palestinians and Israelis, but to create a model of how peoples from different religions and cultures and nationalities and histories and narratives that have been enemies could in fact live together and build a viable system. That kind of a model, I think, could be a model that would be of global significance and not simply a local solution to a local problem. And the fact that, the Palestinians I met in Gaza were talking about how do we get out of that mess, that indicates to me that we could still, for everything else that's gone on, and there'll have to be a deep process of reconciliation, that we could begin to create a state based on this, but we have to really talk about it. And part of the problem, I just mentioned this, I also mentioned, and I think Ali mentioned, the idea of decolonizing Zionism. Well, if Zionism was only a colonial movement, you can't decolonize it. You can't decolonize a colonial movement. It's simply illegitimate. What I'm suggesting is that there was a moment, and I'm not going to get into a lecture on Zionism now. There was a moment, the impulse, the first spark was not colonial. I don't think the Jews in Kishinev or Budapest or Pinsk or wherever in the hell they were in Eastern Europe were thinking about, they weren't like British farmers. They got up one morning and went to Kenya to get free land and cheap labor. That wasn't, the impulse was a genuine, both national, and there was a context to what was going on to the Jews in that part of the world. So that I think that if they're cut a little slack, let me put it that way, because we all live in the real world. We don't know when we're doing things, what we're doing and the implication. There's a context. If we cut a little slack to Zionism, which is a big thing to ask, I know, then you could in fact decolonize Zionism. I'm an example, I think, of a decolonized Zionist, but I certainly moved there. Miko, in other words, there's a lot of Israelis that are active in this movement that show that you can decolonize Zionism. The anarchists against the wall, the kids that are out, the Israeli kids out of Bilin all the time, but you've got to then create a certain space in which Israeliness is somehow acknowledged. The sixth option is what I call the idea of a Palestinian ethnocracy. In other words, again, you're beginning to get, it's a little different from the Algerian model, you're beginning to get the idea, and this is reflected in the one democratic state, you look it up, declaration, in which the idea is, all right, everybody can stay, but there's only one people here, and that's the Palestinian people. And they have rights of self-determination because this is Palestine. The Jews can stay, but as individual citizens, not as any kind of a national sort of a group. And that in some ways, again, kind of replicates the Jewish ethnocracy. The idea, the ethnocracy is a term we use for Israel. It characterizes a state in which a state belongs to one particular group. So the Jews came in and said, this is the land of Israel. It's exclusively ours. We're going to Judaize it. And you Arabs can stay, but you're only Arabs. You're not Palestinians. You don't have any national identity. You're a bunch of Arabs. And that's why, as Miko said this morning, we use the word Arabs and not Palestinians in Israel. But there's a danger of going the other direction and saying Palestine only belongs to the Palestinians. There's only one people that has self-determination. You Jews can stay, but you're only Jews. You're only individuals in our state. And in fact, the one state, and it's a little bit fudged. That's why we need clarity. In the declaration of the one democratic state movement, ODS movement it's called, if you look it up, it says one democratic state in Palestine. Not Palestine, Israel, like the Sabeel in Palestine. And the question is, and it's a very important question, does that mean Palestine as merely a geographic reference to a particular piece of land? Or does it mean Palestine loaded with all the national elements that it has, in which case the question then arises of what happens to the Israelis in the country. So this is another option. And finally, I'll say, because I only have another minute, finally, I think there's another option that I've been writing about. It's probably too abstract, too distant, but I think this is a better model. I'll just throw it into the works. And that is a regional economic confederation, something like the European Common Market was 20 or 30 years ago. that would include, in the first stage, Greater Syria. Replicate that geographic, cultural, economic unit. In other words, that would include Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, into an economic confederation in which the different countries still exist, like in Europe. But you know, the problem we're having in Israel-Palestine, besides the fact that it's so small, and like I said, it's hard to cram all the solutions into it, is that states are a European invention. And they're imposed on peoples. And that's what generates a lot of the conflicts, because the states don't correspond to ethnic, cultural, national, religious lines. And the Middle East is much, the Middle East has many more than 1, 2, 3, 4, than 5 cultures in it. And we see a civil war going on in Syria, 30 years of war in Lebanon, the Israel-Palestine conflict. So to go beyond nationalism, let's go beyond nationalism to what's called, and I learned this from Les Fields yesterday when we were talking, in Latin America they have a concept of multiple nationalities, which is built into, I learned, the Bolivian and Ecuadorian constitutions. The idea being, yes, we're all Bolivians, but we're either Native Americans or we're Hispanic or whatever, or we're in a religious community. There's a lot of different communities, national ethnic identities that we all have, and let's respect them all. We live in a very layered environment, and that's in a sense what this could do. It could create an economic unit that's much more meaningful than simply little tiny countries in a global economy, but at the same time, it could give more latitude, more space to all the different groups that exist in the Middle East to have their identities, have their turf, have their narratives, have their lives, but nevertheless participate in a much larger, democratic, economically prosperous region. So the key in this, like in Europe, is that people in this Middle Eastern Economic Confederation could move around, live and work wherever they wanted to. And, so an Israeli could continue to live in Hebron as an Israeli citizen living in Palestine. But, or let's say Ma'ale Adumim settlement. But the settlement would be integrated because there's no constraints on people living together. In other words, people could live and move and work throughout the region and have their identities and their nationalities and even their countries, but nevertheless open it up like that. So let me end on that, which I'm supposed to have done a few minutes ago. But let me just say then I think that what we need urgently is the in-house dialogue. I think the Palestinians have to sit down together urgently. The diaspora, the refugees inside 48 occupied territories, and really begin to think about where are we going. And I don't think there's beginning to be here and there a few scattered things, but it's not organized. I think also there has to be an intra-Israeli discussion, as somebody has mentioned before, that I think is really important, especially among what I call critical Israelis. And then Palestinians and what I call critical Israelis. What I mean by that is anti-Zionist, or if you want post-Zionist, whatever, non-Zionist Israelis that can conceive of living together in some way, that we begin to sit down with each other and start to thrash this stuff out. This kind of a discussion I'm doing here, this is a little bit in-house. But it's not a kind of a discussion you can have all over. It's not appropriate. This kind of a discussion we should be having, and everybody bringing to the table their views. And really, I think we have to begin to be an agency. We have to begin to become actors and to present a clear idea. And that, for me, is the most urgent need. So I'll leave it at that. So I don't know who's my handler. Should I just, do we have time for questions? Okay, so I don't know where I should go back to, but. All right, questions, arguments, don't have to be questions. We can argue with each other, fight with each other. Oh, wait 1 second, there's a mic. Or here, I'll bring you the mic. This is a full service lecture.
Thank you. I say this is the most rational and complete presentation regarding the one-state solution. We've been hearing about it for quite a long time. And I want to see something happen that's going to work. And I'm wondering if you maintain the 5 requirements, which you say would be essential for
any solution.
Peace, that we would have some real options that we don't see now. Well, the Palestinian 20% who live within Israel are not first-class citizens.
That's right.
They get to vote, but it doesn't mean a darn thing. They are persecuted. They're having their land taken away. There's no sense of justice. The whole Zionist movement is over 100 years old. They've accomplished pretty much exactly what they wanted to do. I can't see how they would backtrack and be sold on these 5 things in any of the. Maybe, I know you live there and I've only visited twice.
Okay.
But I've studied it and I'm just very concerned. Have you tried out any of these ideas on your fellow Israelis?
Okay.
And if so, I'd like to know what
the results were.
I mean, short of the Knesset.
Right. Okay. You want to take a couple questions? Is that the idea?
Anybody else? Can you come up to the mic?
I'm a school teacher. I really probably don't have to because I can talk loud. I would like to open the idea of the gender question. When George Mitchell was asked what would happen in Israel and Palestine, he told the story about the Northern Ireland peace. And he said when the Catholic women and the Protestant women sat down together, there was a peace within 3 hours. When the Palestinian women and the Israeli women sit down together, we will have peace. But you try to elect, right now there are 6 women in Hebron running for offices. Right. They don't have a chance in the world, I'm sure, but by God, I'm for them. Women have traditionally been the protectors of home and peace, and we don't want our men killed anymore. But we're not at the table. Right. They're not there.
One more.
I was reading last week about the Land of Israel lobby. They have like 40 or 50 MKs in the Knesset. So particularly addressing them, how do you see working with that element within this idea of yours?
All right, let me just respond briefly. And that is, although that's not what I'm known for doing, but first of all, I think I see these elements as kind of a filter. In other words, whatever proposal is brought up You know, Bush brings up the idea of whatever, or an Oslo, or Netanyahu, or, you know, in the future, whatever, all of us. Whatever solution is brought up, it should be filtered through these elements. And if it's lacking in one way or another, then it either has to be rejected or fixed. I think this now, like I say, this is just my initial thoughts. I mean, certainly this isn't a definitive list. You know, economic viability might be put into there's other things as well. But I think that this is a good kind of a start in which it gives us the ability to evaluate whether a solution, because a solution isn't only going to be a technical one. If it's going to work, and this is where I connect to the Sabeel conference, if it's going to work, it has to be just. If it's not just, it doesn't address the grievances, the healing can't take place, it's not going to last. And the way to get in a way to nail down what do we mean by just, I think this kind of a list kind of helps, at least to begin to say, well, you know, these are some of the fundamental elements of just, and does this proposal, the solution, you know, how does it measure up to these sorts of things? Now, in terms of the Israeli public, I tell you, in ICAD, that's why I'm here and not in Tel Aviv. The Israeli public is really, or let me put it this way. What we think of as the occupation and oppression and Palestinian issue is a non-issue in Israel. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody really talks about it. It's gone. Because the Arabs are over there somewhere. There's a wall. If our army isn't dealing with it, the PA militia is dealing with the problems. There haven't been attacks for years. Israelis feel a great sense of personal security. The economy is doing great. I mean, it's true, there's social protests, but that's because of the neoliberal allocation. The economy itself is great, just like the United States. It's just the allocation's not good, so that's what creates that. But the Israeli economy is based on arms, homeland security equipment, including to the Albuquerque police force, and the biggest industry in Israel you'll never ever guess, unless you've heard my talks before. Diamonds. Israel's one of the world's centers for cutting and refining and distributing diamonds. That creates a pretty recession-proof economy. The worse things get, the more people want diamonds and arms and security. You see, so the economy is doing well. The United States is still behind us. We don't care about Europe, Shmurup. There was Ben Gurion once said, is the UN in Hebrew. Shmum. Who cares? And including the president. What counts for Israel is Congress. And as long as we have bipartisan support in Congress, wall to wall, we're home free. So the economy is good. We're feeling secure. The Arabs have disappeared somewhere behind a wall. We have American support. What's wrong with this picture? It's perfect, and we can sustain this. So that's created a situation in which you can't get to the Israeli public. Someone once asked me, could I give this talk in Tel Aviv? And the answer is yes, but nobody would come. Because it's not an issue. In Israel, people care about crime, they care about the economy in the sense of the income disparities, they care about religious secular conflicts, they care about certain ethnic things. The latest scandal, we have one president that's in jail for rape, we have another prime minister that's being tried for corruption. I mean, we have a lot of scandals. That's what, and then reality shows. You know, Big Brother, and we have all your American reality shows in Israel, with an Israeli twist to them usually. And that's it. So that what we think we have to do is to go to the international community. That pressures from the outside are the only things that are going to matter. But here we're stuck because governments, and I think Ali mentioned this today, governments deal in conflict management. not conflict resolution. They don't want to, and certainly they don't want to step out and deal with the Israel-Palestine issue. No government, even governments like Ireland, Ireland is probably the most sympathetic government to the Palestinian cause of all the countries in Europe. But if it steps out, first of all, Intel is one of the main industries in Ireland, and the American government will close Intel's military. Ireland does the electronic brains for the Apache helicopters. The United States, if they're not nice to Israel, they'll cut them off in terms of access to American military technology. So Ireland isn't going to go out there and lead the fight. And so we're stuck. And therefore, what we have to do, it's like scratching your ear like this. We have to go to the people, to us, what we call civil society, all over the world, and raise the consciousness, make this an issue, begin to demand. Again brings it back to the thing, we should be more clear about what we're demanding, but certainly BDS is a very important part of that. And light a fire under the politicians who will then begin to change government policy, and Israel would respond to that. So peace is not going to come from inside Israel. But on the other hand, I think Israeli Jews are like the whites in South Africa. They're living a good life. It's a good deal, the way we're living. So why, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But when finally, whoever the de Klerk is, that comes in and says to Israel, it's over, you've got to resolve this conflict, the Israeli public, I think, is there. They know this can't be sustained forever, and they're not going to be an obstacle. But they're also not going to be, the whites in South Africa could have lived for another 100 years with apartheid. There was nothing urgent for them about ending it. But when it ended, they understood that it was over. Even the Afrikaners understood that there was no point in fighting it because it's not going to go on. And so in a sense, the Israelis are irrelevant and have taken themselves out of the game, which means that I think we have to generate pressures from abroad. And in this issue, I just want to say one other thing. I think we're getting to a place where the United States is getting isolated, both on this issue and globally. And we're going to get to a point, Europe is starting to wean itself away from the United States. Certainly, Africa and Latin America, Asia, Middle Eastern countries have done that. So you had in February 2011 a vote in the Security Council about the illegality of settlements. And the vote went 14-1 against the United States. Even Germany, with its history and special relationship with Israel, voted that the settlements were illegal and voted against the Americans. And I think the United States is coming out in general as being hostile to human rights, which is not something that's going to endear it to the rest of the world. So I think the American, and that's one of my messages to, beyond the merits of the Palestinian issue, we should make this an American issue as well. And say to the American people, the United States is paying a price. And you can list the prices that it's paying by its uncritical support of Israel. That the occupation is seen as an American-Israeli occupation. So that's why I think the work that all the groups here are doing, including Sabeel, is just crucial. But that kind of gets to the issue of why I'm in Albuquerque and not in Tel Aviv. So I don't know. I combined two of them, and the issue of the women needs no comment. Where do I sign? No, it's very important, and it doesn't need. All right, so class dismissed. Okay, I hope that was. I forgot the elders. Was that okay?